establish and define a course for Atelier de Lisboa, I invited her to do that. And so in the end of this session, after Susana has shown her artistic work, she will speak about the course if someone will definitely want to know some more about the course. So anyway, Susana, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Obrigada. Obrigada a todos pela vossa presença. Thank you very much for being here. So I would like this to be fairly informal. So please feel free to interrupt me and ask whatever questions you may have. I thought about, instead of talking extensively about my work, I'll just do a short introduction to what I do, and then I sort of have prepared a text that gives you sort of an historical outline of moving image practices that deals more closely with avant-garde and experimental cinema, which is my main area of research. And I will, in the meantime, I will interrupt what I'm talking about to show you some images, because me talking all the time will be probably a little bit boring. We are here to see moving images. This is a moving image practices that we propose. So, and some of the images will be on YouTube, so maybe some commercials will come up, and I apologize beforehand for any commercial delays. I also want to preface my introduction by saying that what I'm going to talk about will leave out a lot of moving image practices and experimental film traditions from Latin America and from Asia, particularly Japan, who have strong moving image practice in the experimental field and expanded cinema field, that we can, for those of you who joined the course and are interested in dealing with those subjects, we can of course go into that. Also, I will not be analyzing particular films, so I will just try to do an overview, mainly historical overview of these expanded experimental moving image practices. And from the viewpoint from where I entered them, which was cinema and other arts. I'm particularly interested in minimalist and post-minimalist art, and so my interest in particularly the work of land artist Robert Smithson is what brought me to the field of moving image and experimental film. So, long story short, let me just start by showing you. So I work, so my main area of work is in moving images, but I also work a lot with photography and sound, particularly what's called field recording. I'm sure all of you have been know about these areas of work. So that's where I come from. So my studies have been mostly in moving image, but I've also studied photography. So I have been working a lot, especially in not with digital, but with analog mediums with photography. And I'm very interested in the connections between people and landscape and geology and the way that our ecosystems change and keep their balances with or without human intervention. So recently I've been working a lot around this idea of geology and the practice of climbing, the history of mountaineering, etc. And so I've been going a lot to mountains and photographing rocks and mountains, etc. And I'm working on a short book that features some of the images that I've been taking over the last few years. These are just some of the examples around these geologically different landscapes, in the sense that they've been changing, slowly changing, because of the action of the tectonic plates, of course, and volcanic activity. So these are just some images that I'm working on towards a book that I've took in Tenerife, in the Canary Islands. This is my preliminary proposal for the book. So they're mostly dealing with the different scales in color. Here you see them in gradations of black and white, of course, and the absence of humans, even though, if you see on the right hand image, you'll find there just two tiny figures in the landscape, which sort of gives you a notion of the scale of these geological landscapes. And it's particularly interesting for me the way that these landscapes change over time, but in a way that's imperceptible to us. We cannot grasp it with our chronological sense. They change all the time, but they're not visible. So the medium of photography or film, I think, allows us to, in a way, investigate these subtle changes in the landscape. And before I show any more images, I would just like to show you a film that has come out of these geological investigations in my own practice of going out into the mountains and climbing and investigating mountains and volcanoes, and derives, of course, from dialogues that I have with fellow artists and fellow climbers, and so I'll be showing you this film, which is a film that it's still in progress. So if you have any comments or any ideas or any exchanges, so by the end of the film I would be very happy to have your input on that. And it mostly derives from home movies that are in the open archives of the Prelinger archive. So I've selected some images and I've edited them in a way that helps me sort of reflect the way that we can use found footage film and think about this inhabitation of geological space, the way that we approach landscape. And when we're talking about home movies, it's very interesting to see, of course, that we tend to photograph the landscape, but we tend to photograph ourselves in the landscape, which is something that is very striking for me. And I've concentrated in the films that I've chosen from the archive, which is an extensive archive, and I invite you to have a look at the Prelinger archives. They do excellent work. It's so I focused mostly on the female figure in the landscape. So let us begin. And I'll be speaking over the images. So there was a moment a couple of years ago when I was in the south of France, and I was climbing up a mountain in the what's called the Vallée des Merveilles, the Valley of the Marvels, and you get up to 2,300 meters altitude, and when you're climbing these very steep landscapes, and you can hear some of the steps that I took over there. You meet a lot of different animals, and you meet a lot of different people who greet you and encourage you to get up to the summit of the mountain and see the surrounding landscape. And I was writing to some friends that I have in Alaska and in France, and we're all thinking about the way that we share an experience of the mountain. And we started thinking about and talking about how in the very beginning women approach the mountain. And as you can see in these pictures, and this is a picture by a famous pioneer of mountaineering called Lizzie Borden. As you can see in these pictures, this is her, Lizzie Borden. We would climb up the mountains in these very long shirts and very encumbered by a lot of paraphernalia, which in the end resulted pretty well for the experience of climbing a mountain. They were not a problem at all, that type of gear. And Lizzie Borden, the lady that you saw in the last photograph that I shown, she actually made a few films in the mountain. She was a pioneer mountaineer, and she was a pioneer filmmaker. And that got me thinking, and that's why I went into the Prelinger archives, that got me thinking about the way that women filmed the landscape, they inhabited the landscape, and how they went up into the mountains. So I found these images. We have no information on the images themselves. Sometimes we can gather that it's the woman filming. Sometimes we can gather that it's a partner, a friend, that's filming them in their wanderings around the landscape. There are many interesting stories around women and climbing. For instance, Lucy Walker, the first woman to climb the Matterhorn. The Matterhorn is a mountain in Switzerland. She frequently drank champagne while on a climb because, altitude effect and champagne helped her to get up the mountain. And she also had a slice or two of sponge cake. And Henriette d'Angeville, a staunch royalist and active self-publicist, celebrated her arrival at the summit of the Mont Blanc by toasting to the Comte of Paris with a bumper of champagne that she carried to the top for that purpose. And from the 1850s onwards, the English had begun to flock across France to the Alps. It was a period of considerable economic prosperity, a time which allowed for philosophical reflection and debate. Walking was a popular activity, appealing to the energetic and the aesthetic alike, as we can see from these ladies over here. So they're fighting bushes and they're fighting mosquitoes. Stendhal walked to Moscow and back, and Wordsworth from Calais to the Alps and back. The vigor of the Victorian period was mirrored by the energetic walking tours undertaken first at home in places like the Lake District and later in the Alps, where the development of the French railway made those mountains accessible. It was not surprising, since their quest was often a spiritual one, that scientists and clergymen tended to dominate these tours, traveling in the same luxurious style to which they were accustomed at home. So there's something that appeals in the landscape and the mountains is that you're always looking up. You want to see the summit. So what are you looking for when you visit places unknown? How do you traverse them? What do you film? Who photographs you and why? The rhythm of walking generates a kind of rhythm of thinking, and the passage through a landscape echoes or stimulates the passage through a series of thoughts. This creates an odd consonance between internal and external passage, one that suggests that the mind is also a landscape of sorts, and that walking is a way to traverse it. A new thought often seems like a feature of the landscape that was there all along, as though thinking were traveling rather than making. And so, one aspect of the history of walking and climbing is the history of thinking made concrete. For the motions of the mind cannot be traced, but those of the feet can. Walking can also be imagined as a visual activity. Every walk a tour leisurely enough both to see and to think over the sights, to assimilate the new into the known. Or perhaps walking should be called movement, not travel, for one can walk in circles or travel around the world immobilized in a seat, or a certain kind of wanderlust can only be assuaged by the acts of the body itself in motion, not the motion of the car, boat, or plane. It is the movement as well as the sights going by that seems to make things happen in the mind, and this is what makes walking ambiguous and endlessly fertile. It is both means and end, travel and destination. And this is something that Rebecca Solnit wrote, not me. So Gwen Moffat, who became Britain's first certified woman climbing guide in 1953, wrote about the immediate satisfactions. And before I started to move, she says, I felt the familiar feeling that came when I was about to do something hard. Mental and physical relaxation, a loosening of the muscles so complete that even the face relaxes and the eyes widen. One's body becomes light and supple, a pliable and coordinated entity to be shown a climb as a horse is shown a jump. In that exquisite moment before the hard move, when one looks and understands, may lie an answer to the question why one climbs. You are doing something hard, so hard that failure could mean death, but because of knowledge and experience, you are doing it safely. She and a partner once decided to set the record for the slowest traverse of ever of a ridge on the island of Skye, and with the help of a surprise blizzard, they probably succeeded. Okay, thank you. So connected to this, I will just show a couple of minutes of another film that I made in those very same volcanic landscapes that I showed you previously. So what I do is I do some field recording, and I mix it with musical sounds that I create, or that some partners in crime create. So there are always these very different layers of sound and acoustics that I introduced in my films, and I also work with sound as its own separate work. For this, for the previous film, so I used mainly musical notes. For this one, it's mainly field recording. So sounds taken on site. So this idea of playing with sound against or with the image is something that interests me very much. And using field recordings and working with music and intermingling them is something that's becoming more and more interesting for me to explore regarding moving image works. Of course, different artists have different approaches. So the sounds that you're hearing are the rumblings of a volcano. And these images are images taken around the Teit volcano, which was famously visited by Humboldt in the 19th century.
General motion, explosion, eruption.
So enough about my work. Thank you very much for your attention. I don't know if you have any questions for me. Feel free to intervene at any moment. Okay, so maybe I can move on to talking a little bit about about the proposal for the moving image course. So as I mentioned before, I will just giving sort of an historical overview of the of moving image practices in connection with avant-garde and experimental cinema, and its place in both in a film theater or in galleries and museums. It's a complicated and very interesting history, the history of experimental and avant-garde cinema. Of course, you can historically pinpoint the 1920s as a period where avant-garde cinema began with the works of filmmakers like Dziga Vertov and Germaine Dulac and other, Buñuel, for instance, and other filmmakers. I will begin mostly with the 1960s and the 1970s and what has been called like sort of a cinematic moment in film history. In cinematic moment in film history, in the sense that a lot of artists, because of the availability of 16mm cameras and video cameras, the first Sony Handycam was created actually in 1967. So a moving image became highly accessible, not only in the field for moving for filmmakers, but other artists that work with sculpture, artists that work with performance art, etc. And so there was this sort of generalized use of moving images, and film was presented or introduced not only in movie theaters, but in galleries and museums as well. And it's a very convoluted and interesting story. Of course, you have those critics and historians that mention that the true experimental film is the film made by the likes of Stan Brakhage, who used only analog films, so he intervened directly in the film. He would paint over the film frames. He would glue insects and plants and flowers directly onto the film. And other critics and other historians would say that the field is larger than that, and they will speak about an expanded cinema. In that sense, you find over there, if you want to have a look, there are many books on the table over there. I brought some that were instrumental in my thinking around this subject, and you will see a lot of different approaches. For instance, you'll find over there a book that deals with the practice of Stan van der Beek, and I don't know if any of you are acquainted with his work. Stan van der Beek would create these immersive environments where he would defy the idea of a film having to be presented in this format, where you have an audience sitting over there and the image is projected over there. So he would have a space and project images on the ceiling, on the floor. People would move about, people would lie on the floor and decide and sort of construct any intended narrative by themselves and the way that they would move about the space. So, a note on terminology. The term moving images, I use them referring to this type of practices that are shown not only in cinemas but in films and galleries, or in film theaters, in galleries and museums. although some historians and thinkers on the subject prefer to use the expression projected image to include works that use slide projectors whose succession of images is made at a certain rhythm, thus animating photographs that become moving images. So cinema has been relegated to the field of industrial cinema, classical cinema, which is something, you know, the cinema that you go see at Nimes or Cinemateca Portuguesa or whatever, which is something that I have a little bit of a problem with, because filmmakers like Hitchcock, there are experimental filmmakers as well. It's just that the mode of production is fairly different than what's been attributed to experimental and avant-garde filmmakers. But we'll deal with that in a moment. So, not infrequently, the confusion between artists' films and avant-garde cinema is perceived, particularly by film theory, as unproductive to say the least, resulting in some film theorists defending avant-garde or experimental cinema as the true cinema with a completely different tradition, practice, institutional exhibition regime from artist's film. One other designation that I'll be talking about and leave a little bit to the side is moving image practices that use video. As I mentioned before, Sony produced the first video camera in 1967. And maybe some of you or all of you know the works of someone like Nam June Paik, who is a precursor of video art. And he would use video and televisions, and he would produce his films and project them in televisions that he would install in a sculptural way in a gallery. So, and he would use the technology of video. What happens with video that doesn't happen with when you shoot with 35mm camera, 16mm camera, Super 8mm camera, is that you get instant feedback. You can get your tape out of the camera, put it on a device and see the image immediately. Whereas when you use analog media, you have to develop the film. So it's a different process altogether, and Nam June Paik would use that to his benefit. So the concepts of feedback, or someone like Rosalind Krauss would talk about narcissism as well, because it's so easy to manipulate a video camera that artists would and do point the camera to themselves. So this idea of video narcissism, the diary of the artist, is something that I will, for the time, leave out of this conversation. It's a different relationship with the media, a different experience. So I'll be talking a little bit more about the phenomenological experience of analog media mostly, okay? What happened when the video camera came to use? Not only this video art is introduced in the galleries and the museums, but also a lot of collectives, because it's fairly cheap to buy a video camera. A lot of collectives came up around the 60s, 70s, 80s, and they created these, what they would call guerrilla TVs. They would, especially in the United States, what they would do, they would assemble in collectives and produce their own programming to be presented to the people of a certain neighborhood. So there was also this activist political use of the video camera, not only to put it in the sanctified, let's call it sanctified space of the gallery and the museum. So the presence of film in the gallery is nothing new, nor is it something specific to the art of the 1960s and 70s, which I've been talking about. Although this is a period of the first period of the explosion or the introduction of film into the gallery and the museum. So experimental films were projected in galleries as early as the 1930s, so before the 1960s and 70s. Joseph Cornell was a sculptor and also a filmmaker, made a film called Rose au Bar, an experimental film. And what he did was, I don't know if any of you know this film, Rose au Bar. What he did was he picked up on a classical film, so a film created in the industrial context, the Hollywood context, and he sort of deconstructed the film. And he concentrated on the female character of the film. And they did a new film altogether. So something that was of the order of melodrama became sort of exotic and sort of a film noir, experimental film noir, let's say. So as you can hear, you introduced a popular song. So it sort of exoticized images that were not exotic to begin with. And this is 1930s, so this is a first approach to an experimental language deconstructing classical Hollywood film. So while we're watching this. So experimental films, as I said, were projected in galleries as early as the 1930s. This film was projected in a gallery, Rose au Bar. But it was in the 1960s that film was introduced in a generalized and problematic way as art in the gallery, in a gravitational movement towards a series of practices and technologies that continues to this day, in which we commonly see, on the one hand, the indecidability between a clear adoption of either the white cube, so the gallery, or the black box, the cinema, and the option of creating artistic work with moving images, fueled by the ease of acquiring equipment, initially 16mm cameras and later video, and today, of course, digital cameras and using non-linear editing systems. So the adoption of the use of moving images and as an artistic tool was a consequence not only of the radical gestures of pop and minimalist artists, but also of the filmmakers of the so-called structural materialist cinema, who, starting from a new perception of the space in which works are presented and the role of the spectator in their constitution, proceeded to phenomenologically analyze the reception of the work of art, as well as analyze and explore the material elements that make up cinema: projector, film, light, camera, screen, in order to demarcate a specific field for these moving images from the other images produced by the mass media. And I'll just quote someone who's important for this context, Andrew Urosky, who wrote about cinema practices between the black box and the white cube, so between cinema and galleries and museums. He wrote, refusing both the commercial cinema as well as its expressive visionary counterpart, artists sought to reconsider both the institutional side and the effective economy of moving image spectatorship as a novel and important domain of inquiry. So when he's talking about visionary, he's thinking about artists like Stan Brakhage and Jordan Belson, which, as I mentioned, Stan Brakhage was a pioneer of experimental film, and he would use the 16mm film. You would paint directly on the film, and you would glue different elements onto the film, and his films would be considered films that were engaged with the act of perception. So you have elements of reality that are presented in a way that has to deal with the vision and the impact of seeing, as Brakhage would say, seeing with one's eyes. So this film is actually called The Act of Seeing with One's Eyes. They were mostly silent, Brakhage's films. This one deals particularly with death, of course. And I have here another example of a more experimental, this one for instance, that he made in 1981, The Garden of Earthly Delights, which what you're seeing are, it's a re-photographing of the film, and the film was glued with leaves and flowers. So what happens here is that you get the film and you paste onto the film directly physical botanical elements, and then you expose them to light. And then you reveal, you go into the lab, you develop the film, and this is what you get. Of course, depending on the velocity of projection, this is 24 frames per second. If you slow it down, it's a completely different experience. So Brakhage was interested in this sort of exploration of reality, but in a way that you get sort of an extreme close-up. And then you have someone like Jordan Belson, who was a painter, and he would use different animation, film animation techniques, and he would use an optical printer, which is when you have a couple of projectors and you have a camera, and you use the projectors to project 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, depending on what your objective is, to project films, and then you have a camera to film the superimposition of all of those different films. And then you get some interesting results. Jordan Belson was interested in a sort of cosmic view of reality and the abstraction, the total abstraction of the image. Yeah, absolutely. He used a lot of optical printing, yeah. Of course, there are many different, sorry, I see a different image in my screen. There are many different interpretations of the work. we're talking about 1960s, 1970s, and there's a seminal work that comes out of this time, Gene Youngblood's visionary film, which is a book that he wrote about the cinema of this time. And so on the one hand, where you have political activist film, you also have, you know, people were more connected with the counterculture experiences with LSD and things like that, and they were interested in a spiritual dimension of cinema. So they were looking, what's the image, what's the film image that we can give to these experiences. So these artists were also working around that. But here we are still thinking about, you know, you have a screen and you have images that are projected onto the screen. At the same time, more towards the late 70s, artists like that were part of the London Filmmakers Cooperative, artists like Peter Giedel, who came up with the name of materialist cinema, Anthony McCall, who has an exhibition right now at the MAT. I don't know if you've been to see it. I strongly encourage you to. They would think about, in terms of what a critic calls, Jonathan Whaley calls, para-cinema. So a cinema that's thinking about the constituent elements of cinema. What does an experience of cinema in a room entices you to? Entices you to look at the image and be immersed in the image and follow a possible narrative or not, but in sort of it thinks about the phenomenological experience of a projected image. And what para-cinema proposes is a different experience of cinema reduced to its elements, so light, camera, projection, etc. So what would this cinema be like? It's maybe a cinema that does not include images themselves. And you have, at the London Filmmakers Cooperative, you have some artists, for instance, like Annabelle Nicholson, who created this performance called Real Time Surreal, thinking about a spool of film, of course, in 1973. And this was an experience of cinema where cinema is a performative act. And what she proposed was you have your screens, you have your audience. The audience is more or less in the customary setting, which is also interesting to think. I'm showing images and you're sitting over there. Why would you not be, I don't know, standing up and right next to the screen, you know? Just thinking about the way that we think about how we engage with the image. And she proposed a performance where she would have a couple of projectors and a couple of spools of film, and they would go through the projector and through that sewing machine that she has there. And every time that the film passed through the sewing machine, she would activate the machine. So the machine, what would the machine do? The machine would perforate the film. And this went on, and the performance ended when the film was so completely, it had so many holes that it could not go anymore through the projector. So that would be, the film would be this performance of the film being produced and destroyed at the same time. So film makes itself and destroys itself. And then of course Anthony McCall, I think I've put, yeah. Anthony McCall is classic work, Line Describing a Cone, which is also a way of thinking about the basic elements of cinema. He also has another project which I can talk a little bit about after. Let's just watch this. And you can experience this at MAT right now until March.
Line Describing Code is 30 minutes long. It's a 16mm film that's projected.
It calls it film, okay?
The projector at one end of the space. What happens at the beginning is that there's a pencil of light that runs through space from the projector to the wall. The image on the wall at that point is just a dot of white light. That dot on the wall gradually traces a circle, leaving a trail behind it. Traces it very, very slowly. It takes half an hour to define an entire circle. And in the end, you have a complete hollow cone of light in space. This has a certain drama to it. As it completes itself, there's a kind of and of course there's no surprise that everyone can see where it's going. And then they kind of begin to quite eagerly wait for it to complete itself. You can watch it however you want, but I'd recommend perhaps try standing with your back to the image and looking toward the projector and see what you see and go from there. It has to be large enough to be capable of incorporating its spectators. The Star Auditorium is an auditorium. It's a traditional film viewing space. It does rather throw into relief what a film viewing situation is usually like. So there'll be a certain improvised spirit, and I would say that the performative aspect of tonight's showing will be rather unique.
So a couple of things are interesting here is the fact that he asks you to face the projector, which is something that you would not normally do. When you're in a film theater, you don't look at the projector, you look at a screen. And he asks you to intervene with the beam. So, Sara, could you put your hand in front? Yeah, so, yeah, intervene. So let's practice some movie making right now. So intervene with the screen, and that's the film, you know. Even though it proposes that there's a line that creates a circle and it's 30 minutes, so you can be there for 30 minutes and wait for the line to create the circle, you could also intervene in the production of the film itself and deconstruct this idea of the film space as the projector where you look up and there's an audience sitting down. Okay, so this is what Jonathan Whaley would call paracinema, but it's also a moving image practice. Okay, and it's moving in many senses. It's you that's moving. It's the image that's moving. Everything moves in this type of proposal. McCall also had a project where he would invite people to go into a room, and the film was, you had a light bulb on the ceiling and a paper with some instructions, and you would go into the room, you would read the instructions would be something like sit over here, walk over there, and the film would be over when the light bulb would extinguish itself or when the sunlight would come up. So you're making the film yourself. It's a different way of thinking about moving images. But this is also a way of thinking about how to engage the viewer, the spectator. In classical film, when you go to see I don't know, Star Wars, what happens? The narrative follows all more or less the same structure. Okay, you have introduction to the characters, you have the storyline that develops, you have the climax, and then a conclusion. Okay, and you're sitting down, and you have the suture-like effect, which means that the narrative is created for you to identify with one or more characters on screen or with the story on screen. It's called the suture-like effect. And these artists aim to sort of deconstruct that thinking or propose new ways to think about it. And for instance, someone like James Banning or Sharon Lockhart, they will do that but in a different way than McCall or Annabelle Nicholson propose. So for instance, James Benning will propose to you something like, I have it here, the sustained attention to an image. So time passes and you observe. James Benning would say, when you start to watch a smokestack scene, it's obviously a smokestack and you can apply particular meanings to that. So what's going on here? We decide, okay? Even cliched meanings like production or a phallic symbol, okay? But since it's on for 7 minutes and a half, and I don't think this is on for 7 minutes and a half, but you leave it on for long enough, you have to deal with it as swirling rain on screen. So near the end of the scene, a plane comes through, so that after you've begun to look at the image formally, it's reintroduced into the narrative. So what James Benning and other artists like Sharon Lockhart propose is that the sustained observation of an image, it's a moving image. Some critics call it a moving still image, okay? So what they propose is that there's something going on, and he wants us to look at what's happening on the screen. So but this takes time, and it takes a phenomenological time, it takes a chronological time, so it takes 5, 7, 10 minutes. It takes the time that we perceive that it goes on for. So maybe we're looking at this and we feel that this is very interesting, and we feel time flying by, or maybe we feel bored and we feel like this takes like half an hour, whereas chronologically it took 5 minutes. But it asks us to observe the image, and in this confrontation with the image, we have to think, what's going on here? What am I seeing? And the predecessor to this is, of course, and I'm sure all of you know this. Where do I have it? Here. The predecessor to this, let me just stop Benning. Okay. Is, of course, Andy Warhol's Empire. So here we have 8 hours. So what's Empire? Empire is a day of filming the Empire State Building. And a few things happen here. There's a lot that happens on the screen. It's like geological time. You know, the mountain or the volcanoes or the landscape are always changing. It's just that we cannot observe it with our own eyes. So a lot of things are changing. The wind is changing, the clouds are changing, the light is changing, and this goes on for 8 hours. So from night till dawn. And it's also, what do we do with this image, with this film? Do we stay for the 8 hours and look at it? Do we leave and come back? Warhol's Empire, an artist called Matthew Buckingham, I think this is very interesting, but it says Warhol's Empire, at the time of the making of the film, had the effect of transforming the cinematic space into something like an installation, because this was shown in movie theaters. The long, static, projected image of a building at night transformed the cinema into a particular place, a particular room. The viewer had to decide how to be a spectator of this film. Where were they going to sit? Were they going to sit through the whole thing? Do they stay for the 8 hours? There's an helicopter. Okay, something's happening. Oh, a plane. Okay. Were they going to come in and out and check it? I mean, I did the experience. I didn't stay for the 8 hours. I came in and out. But it's, yeah. So now when empire is shown in a video projection in a gallery, what happens when you exit the movie theater and you move into a gallery? When it's shown in a gallery, it does little to transform the space because it's a space where you already feel free to come in and out as you choose. Okay? Empire's impact depended on the expectations of cinema that viewers brought to it. Showing empire as a video projection on a wall in a room raises other questions. But on the other hand, what can we gain from deviating from the expectations of the gallery space? So this was going on in the 60s and 70s. On the one hand, you had artists that didn't come out of a film tradition, that were picking up film cameras and video cameras, and they were using them to film their own performances, to deconstruct classical narrative and show films or moving images in galleries and museums and not in film theaters. On the other hand, you also had people that worked exclusively with what we call analog media. They would use Super 8 and 16mm film, and they would, like Stan Brakhage, as I showed you, they would intervene directly in the film, or they would film and edit the film in a way that did not follow classical narrative rules. At the same time, so that's why I told you that this is a very convoluted story. At the same time, film was also used for activist and political purposes. So images, moving images, are being thought and appropriated and worked and edited and collaged in this sort of intermediate environment, and with different expectations or uses for reception and the desired impact that they want to have on the publics that are watching these films. What we are moving towards today, and there's a critic that works in San Francisco, is from Argentina, Federico Winhausen, is a very interesting figure. He proposes that we are working today towards context of collectivity. So what he proposes is that even though we cannot forget the likes of, let me show you one example, pioneers like Maya Deren. Maya Deren is a pioneer of avant-garde film. She's from the Ukraine. She went to the United States, and she was one of the first female filmmakers in the avant-garde tradition. She was a dancer, and she used film to explore the performative capabilities of the moving image. And she was someone that was very active in not only filming, but creating a context for the presentation of these films that didn't necessarily have place in the late 50s, early 60s in a traditional movie theater. As you see, we already have here a few strategies in editing. So she's using reverse. It doesn't have necessarily to do with an ellipsis, you know, going forwards or backwards in time. Again, she's reversing. And in a couple of shots, she introduces us to this sort of dreamlike state. And a fellow artist who was working at the same time as her, who did a completely different body of work, was Jonas Mekas. Worked with 16 millimeter, and
I have never been able really to figure out where my life begins and where it ends. I have never been able to figure it all out, what it's all about, what it all means. So when I began now to put all these rolls of film together, to string them together, the first idea was to keep them chronological. But then I gave up, and I just began splicing them together by chance, the way that I found them on the shelf, because I really don't know where any piece of my life really belongs. So let it be, let it go, just by pure chance, disorder. There is some kind of order in it, order of its own, which I do not really understand, same as I never understood life around me, the real life, as they say, or the real people. I never understood them. I still do not understand them. And I do not really want to understand them.
And that's it. So thank you very much for your attention and your patience. And if there are any questions, thank you so much.